Imagine living in a world where survival was already fragile, where disease could sweep through your village without warning, where famine could strip entire families of hope, and where every little misfortune demanded an explanation. Now imagine that explanation turning toward you, not because you had done anything extraordinary, but because of the simplest choices: owning a cat, gathering herbs, or even laughing at the wrong time. In such a world, fear ruled over reason, and suspicion could be as deadly as any sword. This was the Middle Ages, an age where witchcraft was not a Halloween costume or a character in a fantasy novel, but a real accusation that could drag you from your bed, chain you in front of your neighbors, and decide whether you lived or died. And here's the chilling part: what they considered proof of witchcraft was often nothing more than the kind of things you and I do every single day. Tonight, we are stepping back into that world, peeling away the layers of paranoia and exploring 15 everyday reasons you might have been branded a witch, no matter how harmless your intentions. And I want you to picture this not as a detached history lesson, but as a mirror, because the forces that created witch hunts then, the fear of the other, the suspicion of difference, and the desire to blame someone when things go wrong, are forces that still echo in our own time. Let's begin with one of the strangest and most tragic markers of witchcraft: the cat. In our world today, cats are internet icons, meme-worthy little rulers of couches and windowsills, adored by millions for their aloof charm. But in the medieval imagination, they were not quirky companions. They were the devil's spies. To own a cat was to court suspicion, to feed one was to feed a demon, and to be seen talking to one was to risk being accused of whispering incantations. This wasn't just idle gossip, was a belief reinforced by the very church itself. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a decree linking cats, particularly black ones, with devil worship. Overnight, these animals went from common pets and rat catchers to walking pieces of incriminating evidence. And here's where the cruel irony enters. Across Europe, zealous villagers began killing cats in the name of protecting their souls. A mass slaughter that may have directly worsened the spread of the Black Death. Fewer cats meant more rats meant more fleas, and more fleas meant plague. The very attempt to stamp out evil gave rise to devastation on a scale the villagers could never comprehend. And yet, when the plague hit, who was blamed again? Not the superstition, not the fear, but witches. Think about how icily the ordinary became sinister. A woman stroking her cat in her lap was not showing affection, but supposedly plotting with her familiar. A stray cat scratching someone was not just an accident, but a demonic attack. Even the sound of a cat meowing outside your window could spark gossip that you are harboring something unholy. Imagine being the person who simply loved animals, who fed a hungry stray out of kindness, only to have your neighbors whisper, "She sustains her demon servant." If you spoke to your cat, which we all do, your murmured words of affection could be twisted into secret spells. It's almost comedic from our modern perspective, but for them it was deadly serious. The paranoia created a self-sustaining loop. Fear justified cruelty. Cruelty created new problems, and those problems were blamed on witches. This is where my commentary kicks in. What really killed these people was not witchcraft, but the failure of critical thinking, the refusal to question authority, and the human tendency to scapegoat. The real demon in the story was ignorance, weaponized by power. When you look at how the humble cat became a pawn in this hysteria, you realize that medieval witch hunts weren't about evidence or truth, they were about control. It was about turning ordinary acts into crimes so that anyone could be accused at any time, so the first reason you might be called a witch, owning or even being near a cat. It didn't matter if you were a healer, a widow, or just someone who liked their company. The sight of a cat at your hearth was enough to put you in danger. If cats were enough to put your life at risk, then imagine what happened if you actually possessed knowledge that could heal when prayers and bleeding could not. In the medieval world, medicine was less about science and more about ritual, faith, and superstition. Priests and physicians swore by bloodletting, by draining the body of its fluids, believing that balance would restore health. But if you were a woman with a garden, a collection of herbs, and a knack for mixing teas and salves that actually helped people, suddenly you weren't a caregiver, you were a witch. And the cruel irony is this: what villagers called sorcery was often just early science, the accumulated wisdom of midwives, herbalists, and healers passed down through generations. Chamomile to calm a stomach, valerian to ease nerves, willow bark to fight fever. These remedies worked because they contained compounds we now recognize as the roots of modern medicine. But back then, their effectiveness was precisely the problem. If prayer and leeches failed, but your peppermint infusion relieved indigestion, people concluded you weren't gifted, you were cursed. Your skill was not celebrated, it was feared. Imagine being a midwife called to help a woman in labor. You boil water for sanitation, something unheard of at the time, and suddenly whispers spread that your pot is not full of water, but a witch's brew. You massage the mother's back, easing her pain with touch, and someone watching mutters that your hands are channeling dark power. If the mother and child survive, people claim you bargained with the devil to secure life. If the child dies, they claim you sacrificed it to him. No outcome clears your name. The very unpredictability of childbirth and illness meant someone had to be blamed, and who better than the woman with unnatural knowledge? Now here's my reflection. This reveals a deep tension between institutional power and local wisdom. The church wanted to monopolize healing through prayer and ritual, but ordinary people still turned to the village healer when nothing else worked. That healer, usually a woman, represented an alternative authority, and that made her dangerous. Accusations of witchcraft were often less about what you did and more about what you represented: independence, knowledge, and a refusal to bow entirely to the official hierarchy. It also raises an uncomfortable parallel with today. How often do societies still demonize women for being knowledgeable, outspoken, or skilled in fields dominated by men? In the medieval world, the crime was knowing too much about herbs. In our world, the accusations might take different forms, but the instinct to punish those who disrupt traditional power structures hasn't entirely gone away. Witch hunts may look different, but the psychology behind them hasn't vanished. Picture this: a woman hands a man a small cup of mint tea. Hours later, he feels better and thanks God for the relief. But a neighbor sees it differently. "That's not medicine," she whispers. "She bewitched his insides." And just like that, the woman's entire garden becomes Exhibit A in a future trial, every root and flower reframed as tools of sorcery. Even a simple herb book, a guide that might warn which plants were poisonous, could be treated as a spell book in disguise. The act of learning itself, the act of questioning accepted methods, was enough to brand you a danger. So the second reason you might be called a witch: simply possessing knowledge, especially medical knowledge, that worked better than tradition allowed. And for countless women, that meant their hands their gardens. Their very existence became both life-saving and life-threatening. Now imagine this: your entire fate could hinge not on what you owned, not even on what you knew, but on which hand you used to hold a pen or stir a pot. In today's world, being left-handed is little more than an inconvenience when it comes to scissors or notebooks. Some even take pride in it, seeing it as a mark of creativity. But in the Middle Ages, left-handedness carried a far darker weight. To be born favoring your left hand was to carry a built-in stigma that could follow you from childhood to the grave. The very word sinister comes from the Latin for left. That linguistic link embedded the idea of evil so deeply into European culture that left-handedness itself became a shorthand for corruption, deception, and dark magic. If God blessed with the right hand, then surely the devil whispered with the left. Think of the daily risks this posed. Writing left-handed in a time when literacy was rare already made you stand out. But imagine how it looked to the average village. Ink curling across parchment in a direction they weren't accustomed to. A hand moving in reverse across words that already resembled secret symbols. To their eyes, it looked like runes or coded charms, a language of shadows. A child caught doing this in school might have their left hand tied behind their back until they learned to write with the right. This wasn't just cruelty, it was an act of forced conformity, a way of erasing difference before it had a chance to bloom. And if you happened to fight with your left hand, that was even more dangerous. Instead of admiring your skill, people muttered that only witchcraft could let someone wield a sword with the bad hand and still win. What's striking here is how fear of the unfamiliar was weaponized. The left-handed were not more dangerous, but they were visibly different in a society that demanded sameness. Witch hunts thrived on difference because difference was unsettling. And unsettling was quickly rebranded as dangerous. Let me add this. Left-handedness became a perfect metaphor for how superstition policed behavior. If the community agreed that right was good and left was evil, then to simply be left-handed was to break the invisible rules of the social order. It didn't matter that it was natural, genetic, or harmless. The lesson was simple: fall in line, or risk being accused. The deeper tragedy is that this mindset still echoes in modern life. How often do we punish people today, not because they are doing harm, but because they are different? Being left-handed in the Middle Ages was an early form of othering proof that society has always looked for reasons to mark some as outsiders. Picture a child in a medieval village, scribbling on a slate. Their father beams with pride until he notices which hand the child uses. His smile fades. The whispers begin. Mark my words, that one's trouble. In the church, Christ is painted blessing with his right, while sinners crouch with their left hands raised. Even artwork reinforced the bias, shaping how villagers interpreted everyday life. So whether you stirred soup, held a spindle, or lifted a chalice with your left hand, you could be silently written into a narrative of evil without ever speaking. A word so, the third reason you might be called a witch. Simply being born left-handed, living as a mirror to what society defined as normal. It wasn't about spells or demons, it was about difference being recast as danger. Now, let's shift to something even more human, something almost every one of us does, without thinking, talking to ourselves. In our modern world, muttering under your breath usually means you're rehearsing a conversation, calming your nerves, or realizing too late that your earbuds were never connected. But in a medieval village, talking to yourself was not an innocent habit. It was evidence that you were whispering to unseen spirits, or worse, casting spells. The silence of daily. Life back then amplified everything. There was no hum of traffic, no distant radios, no podcasts playing in the background. If you whispered to your cow while milking it, or sang softly to yourself while feeding chickens, people across the lane could hear every word. And when words are taken out of context, they can be twisted into curses. "Please lay eggs," muttered to a hen, could be heard as "release the plague." One small mishearing could become the spark that set rumors ablaze. This wasn't just about muttering to yourself. Talking to animals was seen as even worse. A farmer praising his horse as a good boy might be suspected of commanding a demonic steed. A woman calling her cat to dinner could be accused of issuing orders to her familiar. Medieval superstition didn't allow for tender companionship, demanded suspicion at every turn. And prayer outside of church was risky too. Whispering a personal prayer at home, in private, looked suspiciously like spellcasting, unless it was supervised by a priest in Latin. The line between devotion and damnation was razor thin, and the wrong whisper in the wrong place could push you straight across it. Here's the deeper commentary. This fear reveals how fragile trust was in a society governed by rumor. If people already believed you were odd or different, your smallest habits became magnified into proof. Talking to yourself became evidence because it allowed others to project their fears onto you. It's a pattern that repeats in human history. The outsider's quirks are never seen as harmless, but as confirmation of suspicion. It wasn't about what you said. It was about who people already thought you were. Think about the paranoia this bred. Imagine a woman walking home, muttering about how she wished the wind would stop rattling her shutters. That very night, the wind calms. By dawn, she has a priest at her door, demanding to know why she's controlling the weather. The coincidence is enough to condemn her. Or imagine humming a tune while brewing ale, and a neighbor swears they heard strange words. That testimony alone could be enough to put you on trial. It's terrifying not just because it's absurd, but because it shows how powerless you would be against the imagination of others. And here's the chilling reflection for us today. How often do we still misinterpret harmless behaviors as something sinister simply because of bias? How many times are people judged not on their intent, but on how others perceive them? In medieval times, the consequence was torture and execution. In ours, it may be social ostracism, suspicion, or worse. Witch hunts may not look the same, but their psychology lives on. So the fourth reason you might be called a witch: talking to yourself, praying outside church, or speaking kindly to your animals. In a world that feared whispers, your words could echo far louder than you ever intended. Now, here's where the absurdity of medieval suspicion really reaches its peak, because in this world, no matter how you behaved socially, you could not win. If you were unusually popular, if the whole village liked you, then clearly you were using spells to enchant people into friendship. And if you were shy, if you preferred to keep to yourself, then clearly you were cursing anyone who came near you. There was no safe balance. Too many friends, too few friends, too much laughter, too much silence. It all fed the paranoia machine. In a community where survival depended on group cohesion, standing out in either direction made you a target. Let's take the case of someone with natural charisma. Imagine you were funny, charming, and helpful. When half the village shows up to help you thatch your roof, your enemies don't say, "Well, she's a good neighbor." They say, "Clearly, she's been sprinkling love potions into the communal ale." Being liked wasn't interpreted as kindness. It was seen as manipulation. The medieval mind couldn't conceive of someone simply having a magnetic personality. It had to be sorcery. And this is revealing it, shows how witchcraft accusations were less about magic and more about explaining what people couldn't understand or what they resented. Now let's flip it. Suppose you were private, content to stay at home, tending your garden and avoiding gossip. That was no safer. The moment misfortune struck, the mill broke, the sheep got sick, the baker's wife tripped over a chicken, the villagers looked around for someone to blame. And who better than the solitary woman who never came to festivals? Her absence became an indictment. You weren't simply quiet, you were plotting under the moonlight. Festivals themselves were dangerous traps. Dance too well and you were accused of tempting men with your wicked moves. Refuse to dance and you were accused of silently cursing those who did. Leave early and they whispered you were rushing home to perform rituals. Stay late and they muttered you were gathering gossip for your next hex. Every choice, every behavior became evidence of guilt. Here's my reflection. This dynamic reveals how paranoia strips away nuance. Human beings are complex. We have different personalities, different levels of sociability. But in a society primed for witch hunts, complexity was impossible. You had to be exactly average, exactly like everyone else, or risk suspicion. And isn't that the very essence of control? By making both extremes dangerous, the system forced conformity, choking individuality until people lived in constant fear of standing out. Even family ties didn't protect you. If your relatives were well-liked, you were accused of leeching off their good reputation with magic. If your relatives were disliked, people assumed witchcraft ran in the bloodline. It was an airtight system of paranoia that fed on itself. Trying to correct your image only made it worse. Become more social and people muttered you'd made a new pact. Withdraw into solitude and they muttered you were plotting something big. There was no winning. This is one of the most telling insights into witch hunts, and it still resonates today. It shows how fear of difference becomes self-reinforcing. Once a group decides you're suspicious, everything you do confirms it. You're trapped in their narrative. Witch hunts weren't just about killing individuals, they were about enforcing sameness, silencing those who lived outside the norm. So the fifth reason you might be called a witch: simply being too popular or too solitary, caught in the no-win trap of social suspicion. Your very personality, whether vibrant or reserved, could turn you into a target. If there was one role in medieval society that straddled the line between revered and reviled, it was the midwife. On one hand, she was indispensable. Women depended on her knowledge, her calm presence, and her remedies to guide them through childbirth, one of the most dangerous moments of their lives. On the other hand, she walked daily on the edge of suspicion, because the very unpredictability of birth meant someone always had to be blamed. If the mother and baby survived, people whispered that she must have bargained with dark powers to cheat death. If the baby died, they accused her of sacrificing the child to those same powers. Success was proof of sorcery, failure was proof of sorcery, and no outcome could clear her name. Picture this: a midwife entering a cottage at dawn, her satchel full of herbs, cloths, and knowledge passed down through generations. She eases the mother's pain with chamomile, rubs her back with oil, and whispers soothing words. To the desperate family, her skills bring comfort. To a nervous neighbor listening outside, her chants sound like incantations. When she boils water, a practice rooted in hygiene. The onlookers mutter that only witches boil water after all. It's extravagant, unnatural proof of brewing potions. In a culture where most people didn't understand biology, superstition filled the gaps, and the midwife was the perfect scapegoat. The paranoia ran deep because midwives carried more than herbs. They carried knowledge. They knew which families had miscarriages, which women had secretly ended pregnancies, and which children bore suspicious resemblances to men outside the marriage bed. In a world where gossip spread faster than the plague, this knowledge made people uneasy. A midwife could become the keeper of too many secrets. And when someone knows too much, the easiest way to silence them is to accuse them. Here's my commentary. The treatment of midwives reveals how societies weaponize fear against women who hold essential, independent knowledge. Midwives were among the first practitioners of community health, but because they operated outside the church's rigid control, their power was destabilizing. In many ways, the persecution of midwives was less about childbirth and more about controlling who was allowed to wield knowledge, especially knowledge tied to women's bodies. It's not hard to see parallels in how women's healthcare has been politicized across history, where those who provide it are painted as dangerous, suspect, or unnatural. Witchcraft accusations weren't just about superstition, they were about policing power. Imagine being a midwife in the Middle Ages. You deliver 10 healthy babies, but one dies from an infection you couldn't prevent. That one loss is enough to undo everything. Or worse, a rival, a jealous neighbor, or a spurned suitor could accuse you out of malice, and the entire village would nod, because they were already primed to see childbirth as a battlefield between God and the devil. No matter how skillful, how compassionate, or how necessary you were, you walked every day with a noose, waiting to tighten. So, the sixth reason you might be called a witch. Simply being a midwife, a woman entrusted with life. At its most fragile moment, to some, you were a healer. To others, you were a sorceress, bargaining in blood. If healing was dangerous and childbirth was perilous, then nothing was more treacherous than the weather itself. In the Middle Ages, storms, droughts, hail, and frost were not seen as natural phenomena but as divine signs, or, worse, the direct handiwork of witches. Imagine how terrifying that would be. Every shift in the sky, every ruined harvest, every strike of lightning could be pinned on you simply because you were different, disliked, or lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meteorology wasn't a science then, it was a blame game. If hail flattened the barley crop, someone had to be responsible. And if you already had a reputation as odd, the villagers would point at you without hesitation. Consider the absurdity. A lightning bolt strikes near your house. Proof, they said, that you had summoned fire from heaven. A late frost kills the seedlings. Clearly you whispered to the moon and bound the crops. Too much rain, you were flooding the land. Too little, you were holding the clouds hostage. The logic was never consistent, because it didn't have to be. All it required was fear and a scapegoat. Even travelers could worsen your fate. A passing merchant says, "The weather was fine until I reached this village, and suddenly, congratulations, you are now the village's storm caller." Nobody questions the stranger. They question you. One of the most bizarre beliefs was that witches could milk storm clouds, squeezing rain out of the sky as farmers squeezed milk from cows. It sounds ridiculous now, but two people desperate for explanations, it was gospel. Priests reinforced it from the pulpit, warning that witches steered storms to punish sinners or to protect their own fields. So if your garden somehow thrived while your neighbors wilted, that wasn't good soil or careful tending, it was witchcraft. And when nature turned against you, when drought starved the animals or floods drowned the fields, villagers looked not at the heavens but at each other. The weather became another battlefield, where fear devoured reason. Here's my reflection. This fear of weather manipulation reveals the human urge to explain chaos. In a world where survival depended on harvests, the unpredictability of nature was unbearable. Instead of accepting uncertainty, people created villains. Witchcraft filled the gap left by ignorance, turning natural disaster into a crime. And what's more chilling is how quickly misfortune united a community not against the storm, but against one of their own. When fear rises, people often choose scapegoats over science. And doesn't that pattern echo today, whenever disaster strikes and we rush to blame rather than understand? Imagine the terror of living under that shadow. A woman mutters about wishing the rain would stop, and 2 days later, the sky's clear. Suddenly the priest is knocking at her door, demanding to know why she controls the elements. Or a farmer happens to be in the field when the clouds break into rain. The timing alone is enough to mark him guilty. No defense matters, because coincidence becomes evidence, and evidence becomes a death sentence. So the seventh reason you might be called a witch: simply being connected, however accidentally, to the weather. Your life could be destroyed by nothing more than the wind changing direction. If storms and droughts could condemn you, then your very skin could betray you too. In the Middle Ages, the human body was read like a book of signs, and every mole, freckle, scar, or birthmark could be twisted into evidence of a pact with the devil. These so-called witches' marks were said to be the devil's signature, his brand seared into flesh to seal a contract. Forget paper and ink. Medieval imagination believed demons preferred to sign their deals directly on the human body. If you had a mole near your neck or arm, people whispered it was where you're familiar. Your animal-shaped demon suckled like a dark parody of motherhood. A strawberry-shaped birthmark might be called the devil's brand. A scar from an accident reinterpreted as proof of a midnight ritual gone wrong. It didn't even have to resemble anything sinister. Villagers were eager to see symbols where none existed. The moment someone said, "Doesn't that look like a crescent moon?" your fate was sealed. Witch hunters even developed methods for proving these marks. They would strip the accused and poke suspicious spots with needles. If the mark didn't bleed or hurt, they declared it unnatural, proof of a demonic pact. Of course, skin sensitivity varies, so sometimes people simply didn't feel the prick, and in that arbitrary moment, their guilt was confirmed. If you said you'd been born with it, then clearly you had been born a witch. If you said it appeared later, then clearly it was the moment of your pact. No explanation could save you. Even beauty marks that today might land someone on the cover of a fashion magazine could have landed them at the stake. This obsession reveals a lot about medieval psychology. People wanted physical proof of invisible crimes. Fear thrives on something visible, something you can point at and say, "There, it's real." In an era where disease, famine, and storms felt random and terrifying, marks on the body became anchors for paranoia. They turned the abstract fear of evil into something concrete. And tragically, they gave mobs and inquisitors a reason to act, to feel justified in their cruelty. Here's my reflection. The witch's mark tells us that people often project fear onto what they don't understand. Instead of seeing a birthmark as a quirk of nature, they turned it into a portal for demons. It wasn't about the mark itself, but about the need to believe that evil had a tangible foothold in the world. And isn't that still a pattern? Continue to stigmatize physical differences, whether it's scars, disabilities, or simply traits that set someone apart. The witch's mark was just an extreme version of humanity's enduring fear of difference carved into the body. Imagine the humiliation of being accused. Your clothes stripped in public, strangers crowding around to inspect your skin like livestock, every freckle debated as evidence. And the worst part, you couldn't argue logic against fear. The marks became a story others told about you, and you had no power to rewrite it. So the 8th reason you might be called a witch: having a birthmark, a scar, a freckle your own skin used against you as proof of dark allegiance. If your skin could damn you, then your kindness could too, because in the Middle Ages, even helping someone heal too quickly was enough to raise accusations of sorcery. Think about the irony here. At a time when medicine was primitive, when recovery was often slow, painful, and more dangerous than the illness itself, success was suspicious. Medieval medicine relied on bloodletting, leeches, and prayer. If you bled half a patient's fluids while muttering Latin and they lingered on in agony, that was acceptable. But if you brewed a simple tea from willow bark and brought down their fever overnight, suddenly you weren't gifted, you were interfering with divine will. To heal too fast meant you were cheating God's system. Imagine the risk. The baker's wife has been bedridden for a week. You bring her a bowl of chicken broth or an herbal infusion. She drinks, and by morning she is up, smiling and walking around. To us, that's compassion. To her neighbors, that's resurrection. Magic, instead of gratitude, you are met with suspicion. She brought her back from death's door, someone mutters, but how? Healing was never neutral, it always had to be explained. If you healed slowly, you were following tradition. If you healed swiftly, you were a witch. This is one of the most tragic aspects of the witch hunts, because it shows how goodness itself could become dangerous. Herbalists, midwives, and healers weren't punished for causing harm, they were punished for being too effective. It's the medieval version of no good deed goes unpunished. And it tells us something important about fear. When people are more committed to their worldview than to results, they will reject anything that challenges their expectations, even life-saving acts. There's also a political layer here. Priests and physicians held authority, but when ordinary women could heal better than the experts, it threatened the established order. The label of witchcraft wasn't about the cure, it was about power. By criminalizing effective healing, the church and elite men kept control, ensuring no one outside their structure could rise too high. This is a reminder that witch hunts weren't random outbreaks of paranoia. They were systems of control dressed up as moral panic. Think about how chilling that is. A woman who cures a fever might be accused of cursing the patient's insides. A healer who helps the unpopular farmer get back on his feet is suddenly in league with the wrong sort of people. And if you kept your recipes secret to protect your livelihood, people assumed you were hoarding forbidden knowledge. Secrecy became proof, effectiveness became guilt, compassion became crime. So the 9th reason you might be called a witch: healing someone too quickly or too effectively. The very act of saving lives could sign your death warrant. If helping people was dangerous, then imagine how much more dangerous it was simply to survive your husband. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't just about love, it was about property, security, and the social order. A husband's death meant inheritance, debt relief, and in many cases, a woman suddenly gaining more independence than was considered acceptable. And that independence, in the eyes of a suspicious village, was not a tragedy to mourn, but an opportunity to accuse. A young widow was a walking contradiction, a woman without male protection, yet still standing strong. To them, it looked less like resilience and more like witchcraft. Picture it. If your husband had been sick for months and finally passed, the whispers started. You let the illness linger so you could inherit. If he died suddenly, even worse clearly, you poisoned him, or whispered him into the grave with a bedtime hex. If he died peacefully, they said you lulled him into the afterlife with dark charms. If he died screaming, they said you dragged him to hell yourself. There was no scenario in which the widow could win. Every outcome was folded neatly into the same damning narrative. She had a hand in it, and even after the funeral, your behavior remained a trial. Grieve too little, and you were cold-hearted, probably thrilled to be free. Grieve too much, and you were clearly overcompensating to hide your guilt. Move on quickly, and you had planned the whole thing. Refuse to remarry, and you must be living off the devil's pension. The standard was impossible, because it wasn't about truth, it was about control. A man who remarried weeks after his wife's death was simply practical, needing someone to cook and manage the household. A woman who did the same was a black widow, accused of plotting her husband's end all along. The double standard was baked into the system. Here's my commentary. Widowhood, as witchcraft, shows how much fear was tied to women's independence. A woman who no longer needed male protection was terrifying to a society built on hierarchy and dependency. The accusation of witchcraft was a convenient way to punish her for stepping outside the prescribed role. In other words, the crime wasn't murder or magic. The crime was survival on her own terms. That's why widowhood became such fertile ground for suspicion. It challenged the fragile power balance men worked so hard to maintain. And here's the chilling thought for us today. The story may have changed, but the suspicion of independent women has not entirely vanished. The labels are different now, cold, calculating, ruthless, but the instinct to demonize women who thrive without fitting into expected roles still lingers. Witchcraft accusations were simply the medieval vocabulary for the same old fear of female autonomy. So, the 10th reason you might be called a witch: being widowed too young, living on your own, and showing the world that you could survive without a man. That resilience was not admired, it was feared. Now imagine that it wasn't your husband's death or your healing hands that condemned you, but something as simple as the objects lying around your home. In the Middle Ages, anything unusual, anything that couldn't be easily explained by the average villager's limited experience, could instantly become evidence of witchcraft. And remember, most people's world was very small. If they had never seen it before, they assumed it had to be dangerous. A shiny rock, a strangely carved spoon, a shell carried inland from the coast, even a book full of drawings, each one was a potential ticket to the stake. Picture a compass in a society where navigation was done by memory and landmarks. To you, it's a tool. To them, it's sorcery, a device that points toward unseen forces. A magnifying glass, simple optics to us, was witchcraft to them, a lens that could summon fire from the sun. Jewelry with strange engravings, obviously. A talisman that let you summon storms or read minds. And heaven help you if the engraving was in a language no one recognized, if it was just sloppy Latin from a local blacksmith. To the court, that wasn't bad. Grammar, it was a secret code for demons. Books were especially dangerous. With literacy rates abysmally low, most villagers couldn't read, and so writing itself looked like magic. A recipe book might be called a spell book. An herbal guide for poisonous plants might be twisted into a grimoire of curses. Even a family's written bread recipe could be reframed as summoning delicious, but evil pies. Inquisitors leaned into this ignorance, pulling dusty volumes from shelves and waving them like smoking guns. For the accused, there was no defense. Education was evidence enough. And the cruelest part, many people didn't even know they owned something suspicious. An odd figurine passed down from a grandmother, a dried plant left in a cupboard, or a carved bead bought from a traveling merchant could all be twisted into proof of dark pacts. The more foreign or exotic the object, the more damning it became. A figurine from far-off lands wasn't a keepsake. It was an idol of demons. An oil bottle from another market wasn't perfume, it was a potion bottle. Everyday objects became terrifying simply because they weren't familiar. Here's my reflection. This paranoia about objects highlights a deeper truth. The witch hunts weren't about evil, they were about ignorance. When people lack understanding, they filled the gap with fear. And when fear is fueled by authority, it becomes lethal. This wasn't really about spoons or books or beads. It was about punishing anyone whose possessions suggested they had access to knowledge, trade, or culture beyond what the average villager could grasp. In short, owning something unusual made you suspicious because it made you different. And different was dangerous. So the 11th reason you might be called a witch: having strange, unfamiliar objects in your home. What we'd consider trinkets, curiosities, or treasures were, to them, cursed relics of the devil. If owning strange objects could doom you, then so could something even more: human laughter. In a world so bleak, where life expectancy was short, where disease and famine haunted every season, you would think laughter would be cherished. But no. In the medieval imagination, laughter at the wrong time was not joy, not nervous release. It was evidence of the devil whispering jokes in your ear, a smirk during a sermon, proof that Satan distracted you, a chuckle at a funeral. Clearly, you were pleased because you had caused the death. Even harmless private amusement could be turned into damning evidence. Picture this: you're at church. The priest stumbles over his Latin so badly it sounds like he's blessing a goat. You suppress a laugh, but a smile slips through. Immediately, eyes narrow, the devil has her, someone whispers. Or imagine you're at a funeral, grief heavy in the air. One of the pallbearers trips, nearly dropping the coffin, and you stifle a laugh because the scene is absurd in its tragedy. But to the grieving crowd, your grin is not accidentally, is gloating. And just like that, you are no longer a mourner. You are a witch revealed. Even more absurd were the dangers of laughing alone. Imagine you are sewing or stirring a pot, lost in thought, when a funny memory makes you laugh to yourself. Someone overhears and assumes you're sharing a joke with your invisible familiar. Or worse, you laugh at the wrong person's story. Fail to chuckle at the Lord's joke. Clearly you are cursing him silently. Laugh too loudly at a peasant's jest. Clearly you're mocking the hierarchy. Even the sound of your laugh could betray you to shrill, to cackling, too unusual, and suddenly you were no longer eccentric, but inhuman. Here's my reflection. This obsession with controlling laughter shows how fear polices joy. In societies consumed by paranoia, even positive expressions become suspicious. Witch hunts weren't just about punishing difference, they were about suffocating spontaneity, enforcing silence, and stamping out anything that couldn't be neatly explained or controlled. Laughter, unpredictable and uncontrollable, frightened them because it broke the rules. It slipped through the cracks of conformity, and fear always seeks to control what it cannot understand. Think about the cruel irony. In a world brutal and short, where laughter should have been a rare mercy, it was treated as contraband. People learned to ration their joy, to weigh every smile against the risk of suspicion. To laugh freely was to risk chains. That's what witch hunts stole, not just lives, but the simple human freedom to feel. So the 12th reason you might be called a witch: laughing at the wrong time, smiling in the wrong place, or possessing a laugh that sounded too strange. Joy itself could be criminalized when fear ruled the world. Now imagine that instead of laughter or odd objects, the greatest crime you could commit was wanting peace and quiet. In the Middle Ages, solitude itself was suspicious. Privacy was rare. Families crammed into cottages. Apprentices lived with masters. Widows often moved in with relatives. To live alone was not seen as independence, but as isolation, and isolation meant secrets. And in the fearful minds of villagers, those secrets weren't harmless, they were rituals with Satan. A cottage on the edge of the woods wasn't a quiet retreat. It was a witch's lair. Smoke rising late at night wasn't warmth, it was potions bubbling. A shuttered window wasn't privacy, it was concealment of rites too horrible to witness. Even lighting a candle at midnight was reinterpreted not as sewing or mending, but as conversing with spirits. Think of the practical reasons someone might live alone. Perhaps rent was cheaper on the outskirts, or maybe neighbors stole your firewood, or maybe you simply preferred your own company. None of that mattered. Medieval logic twisted solitude into guilt. The hermit, the recluse, the independent woman, they all became easy scapegoats. And in a society where gossip traveled faster than reason, once someone labeled you a witch, your silence was not defense, it was confirmation. After all, only someone with secrets would keep so quiet. Here's my reflection. This suspicion of solitude reveals a deeper truth about witch hunts. They were never just about superstition. They were about enforcing conformity. To live differently, to choose your own rhythm, was to reject the crowd, and rejecting the crowd made you dangerous. Fear thrives on sameness. Difference becomes a threat. Even today, how often do we judge those who live outside the social mold, not because they've harmed anyone, but because their choices unsettle us? Witch hunts show us the dark edge of that instinct, the point where suspicion turns deadly. And remember, the association of witches with the forest, a solitary woman in the woods, didn't come from nowhere. It came from centuries of branding. Solitude as sinister. What we now romanticize in fairy tales was once a death sentence. Solitude was freedom, and freedom was feared. So the 13th reason you might be called a witch: choosing to live alone, away from the watchful eyes of neighbors. Independence itself was transformed into a crime. Now imagine the danger of seeing the obvious and saying it out loud. In the Middle Ages, making predictions, any predictions, was a treacherous game. You didn't need to forecast the king's death or the end of the world to land in trouble. Something as harmless as saying, "Looks like rain tomorrow," could brand you a witch. Why? Because if you were right, people assumed you hadn't guessed you had summoned. And if you were wrong, people conveniently forgot. The only predictions anyone remembered were the ones that matched reality, and coincidence became evidence. Of sorcery, picture a woman noticing dark clouds and telling her neighbor, "Best to cover your hay before the storm." A week later, lightning strikes the church steeple. No one praises her foresight. Instead, they whisper, "She brought the lightning." Or imagine warning a farmer that his roof might not survive winter. Months later, it collapses under snow. And suddenly your words aren't advised, they're curses. Even the simplest statement about crops or animals could be twisted. If you guessed a cow was pregnant, you weren't just observant, you had consulted unholy forces. If the calf was born with odd markings, that sealed it. You had cursed it for your amusement. And here's the chilling irony. Certain professions, farmers, shepherds, sailors, relied on predictions. They had to read the signs of weather and seasons to survive. But if you weren't in those roles, your predictions were seen as stepping into forbidden territory. It wasn't about the act, it was about who was allowed to do it. Authority controlled knowledge, and anyone who dared cross that line without permission risked being labeled a witch. This speaks to something deeper: fear of foresight. Prediction is power. If you can anticipate the future, you hold an advantage over others. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, that advantage had to be suppressed unless it came from the right people. Witch hunts were never just about superstition, they were about policing who had the right to knowledge and the right to speak it. And when ordinary people dared to predict, they were punished for overstepping. Reflect on how this plays out today. How often are visionaries dismissed or vilified, not because they're wrong, but because they threaten the status quo by seeing too clearly. The medieval fear of prediction reminds us that societies often punish those who notice patterns before others are ready to accept them. So, the 14th reason you might be called a witch: making predictions, whether about storms, crops, or even everyday accidents. To anticipate the future was to claim a power too close to the divine, and that made you dangerous. And now we reach perhaps the cruelest reason of all: the crime of growing old. In the Middle Ages, life expectancy was short. Disease, famine, war, and childbirth claimed lives early and often. To live past 40 was already remarkable. To reach 70 or 80 was practically miraculous. And yet, instead of celebrating longevity, people looked at the elderly with suspicion. How could she have lived so long, they asked, unless she had stolen someone else's life to do it? Longevity itself was treated not as fortune, but as proof of sorcery. Imagine the weight of that. Your hair turns white, your back bends. With years of labor, your face is carved with wrinkles. To us, these are signs of endurance, of wisdom hard-earned. But to them, each line was evidence of dark bargains. Wrinkled skin, the devil's mark. Failing eyesight, the punishment for too many candlelit rituals. A hunched back, proof you had carried a cauldron too long. Missing teeth, clearly you had pulled them to use in potions. Even your sharpness of mind could betray you. If you remembered things others forgot, if you spoke with clarity when most your age were fading, then clearly you were hoarding forbidden knowledge, and without a husband to protect you, old women became easy targets. Widowed and childless elders had no one to defend them, no family ties to shield them from suspicion. They became socially adrift, and therefore vulnerable. To a fearful village, they were not survivors, they were threats. A woman who endured long past her peers became a walking repository of unease, a reminder of everything uncanny. People began to stitch stories around her: the midwife who once whispered about rain, the neighbor who muttered while sewing, the woman who never seemed to die. By the time she reached old age, she was no longer seen as a person. She was a legend of suspicion, a scapegoat wrapped in flesh. Here's my reflection: nothing reveals the cruelty of witch hunts more than this. What should have been honored age, survival, resilience, was instead punished. Witch trials were never about crime, but about fear weaponized against those who couldn't defend themselves. The elderly, especially women, became targets not because of what they did, but because they outlived the narrow boundaries society had set. Their very existence defied expectation, and in a world ruled by fear, defiance became guilt. Think about what that says about human nature. When we don't understand something, whether it's a birthmark, a healing, or simply a long life, we invent sinister explanations. We punish difference instead of learning from it. And the tragedy of the witch hunts is that wisdom, experience, and survival qualities we should value most were twisted into evidence of evil. So, the 15th reason you might be called a witch. Growing old, the greatest crime of all, was living longer than others thought you should. So now we've traveled through all 15 reasons. And what strikes hardest is not the absurdity of the accusations, but the terrifying pattern beneath them. Cats, herbs, left-handedness, laughter, solitude, predictions, old age, all of them were ordinary, human, harmless. Yet each was twisted into evidence of evil by fear, ignorance, and a need for control. That's the lesson hidden in the ashes of the witch hunts. Witchcraft was never really about magic. It was about difference. It was about scapegoating. It was about punishing those who stepped outside the narrow expectations of their society. And most of all, it was about power. Power wielded by those who controlled the narrative. By priests, inquisitors, and fearful neighbors who found it easier to condemn a woman than to face uncertainty. The witch hunts remind us of something deeply uncomfortable. Human beings, when frightened, often choose blame over truth. We look for someone to accuse, someone to carry the weight of our fears, even if that person has done nothing wrong. That instinct hasn't gone away. We see echoes of it in how we treat outsiders, how we demonize difference, how quickly rumor can destroy a life even today. The form may change, but the psychology remains. Witch hunts are not just history, they are a mirror. So the lesson is, this fear thrives where understanding is absent. Ignorance gives birth to cruelty, and when we let superstition, gossip, and prejudice replace reason and compassion, ordinary people pay the price. If we remember anything from these stories, let it be that suspicion is easy, but empathy is hardened. It is empathy that saves lives. The women and men burned as witches were not villains. They were neighbors, healers, mothers, widows, and elders. They were human beings caught in a storm of paranoia. Their tragedy is our warning, and as the camera fades, let the final thought settle. The real danger was never witches, it was fear itself.